Well, if you were to describe me or write something about me, you'd realize that there's a lot to who I am. If you were to ask Grace and you could understand her, she would say that I was Daddy. Or she would say that I was Daddy Butterfly. It was according to if she wanted to go to bed and fly around, which is what happened the other night. If you talked to Nellie and it was a good day, she would say that I was a loving husband. If you would ask yourself, you may say that I'm a friend, or I'm your pastor, or I'm that preacher down at Driftwood, and I hope we get to know each other a little bit more than that. But you can see that there's a lot to who I am, and it's the same for you. There's a lot to who you are. Well, we're starting a new sermon series today where we're looking at 4 portraits, 1 Jesus. Because the gospel writers, each of the gospel writers has a different point that they want to look at when it comes to Jesus. Mark has something he wants to focus on, and Matthew has something he wants to focus on, and so on. So for the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at each gospel. So we're going to take a step back and look at it at an overview. Because I think sometimes we miss the forest because of the trees. We've just spent 12 weeks looking at Philippians, and it's actually a quick way of going through Philippians. We could have spent a lot more time within it. So today we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. Mark is thought to be one of the first Gospels that was written. It was written probably somewhere around the 50s or the late 60s AD. And it was written by John Mark. And it's thought to be maybe Peter's account of the Gospel. But Mark's Gospel, it focuses more on the deeds of Jesus than it does on his words. And one of the first themes that we see within the book is Jesus as the faithful one. And there's a lot of triads within this book, a lot of threes. 3 times Jesus was on a boat, and the disciples revealed some lack of faith they had, some failure to understand Jesus' ministry. 3 times Jesus predicted his own death, and each time the disciples responded with some sort of act of pride or of ignorance, and Jesus had to teach them the cost of discipleship. 3 times Jesus prayed in the garden, and he would come back and he would find his disciples asleep. 3 times Peter denies Jesus. So we see a lot of 3s. And for the Jew, 3 was a very special number. 3 meant completeness. And really what I think Mark is showing here is just the completeness of the disciples' failures. They messed up quite a bit. Actually, out of probably all of the other Gospels, Mark seems to be one of the hardest on the disciples. He points out their failures, the times they mess up. But he points them out in light of Jesus' faithfulness. Jesus is faithful even when the disciples fell. We looked at this some last night at the campfire. We looked at Peter's denial of Jesus that was recorded in the Gospel of John. And how Peter was around a charcoal fire when he denied who Jesus was. And later on, after Jesus' resurrection, Jesus made them breakfast when they was out fishing, and he made the breakfast over the charcoal fire. So that when Peter would get there, he would see this charcoal fire, which was a unique fire in that day. And it would have been a reminder of his failure. Jesus wouldn't overlook it. He did not overlook his failure, but he loved him in spite of it. Jesus didn't overlook his failure, because that's exactly why he went to the cross, was because of our failures. And if we look at our life, I'm sure we can look at past events that we wish that we could go back to, that we could just rewrite history, that we could change it. Some time in our life that we wish we didn't go down that path, and we've seen ourselves as a complete failure. And I'm sure if we're honest with ourselves, we can look at our life today and we can still see those moments. Those times in our life that we stumbled, those times that we fell, and oftentimes we wonder, what is Jesus thinking about me? Will he reject me? How does Jesus deal with my failures? I think he dealt with it the same way with Peter. He didn't overlook them, but he loves us in spite of it. He's faithful. So the reason he went to the cross was because of our failures. Jesus is faithful. Why does? He loves us even though we do still sometimes, maybe oftentimes, fail and stumble. So Mark makes for sure that he points out Jesus as the faithful one. But if we were to divide Mark's gospel up, Mark can really be divided into two sections. The first section would be chapters 1 through 7, and what it focuses on is Jesus as the mighty Messiah. So we've seen Jesus as the faithful one. Now Mark's describing Jesus as the mighty Messiah. And the key word that we see throughout this section is the word authority. Jesus has authority. And one of the greatest pictures of this is at the end of Mark chapter 4 and all the way through Mark chapter 5. In Mark chapter 4, what we see is the event where Jesus calms the storm. The disciples, they were out on the boat with Jesus, and Jesus goes to sleep. And the storm comes out of nowhere. And there's these fishermen that were on the boat. Many of Jesus' disciples were fishermen, so they have faced storms like this before. So I'm sure they probably did about everything they could, but they thought they was going to perish. And they go and they wake Jesus up and they say, "Don't you care? Don't you care that we're going to perish?" And Jesus gets up and he rebukes the winds and the waves. And I love what the Message paraphrase says. It says, "And it became as smooth as glass." Mark showing that Jesus has authority over creation. He has authority over nature. Now, Mark moves into the story at the beginning of chapter 5, where Jesus gets off the boat again. And he comes upon this man that's demon-possessed. And the demons has caused this man to cut himself. They tried to chain him, but he would just break through the chains. The demons has really tormented this man. And when they see Jesus, they fall down and ask, "What are you here for?" And Jesus asked, "What's your name?" And they said, "Legion," because we are many. Jesus does cast them out into the pigs, where the pigs go and they drown themselves. It's a vivid reminder to us that Jesus has authority over the demons. Oftentimes the things that we may be afraid of, or scared of, or don't like talking about because we don't want to talk about those evil forces, but Jesus demonstrates authority even over the legion. They were terrified when they came into his presence. Mark moves on and he goes into the story of a woman who was subject to bleeding. Jesus was walking through this crowd. He was actually trying to go to Jairus' house, which was a man where his daughter was sick, about to die. And the woman thought to herself, "If I just touch his cloak, I will be healed." And she does. And Jesus feels the power go out of him. And he turns around and he asks the question, "Who touched me?" Now the disciples thought he was a little crazy because there was a big crowd around, and they're like, what do you mean who touched you? You're surrounded by people, of course somebody's going to bump into you. But he knew. And she came forward, and he told her that she could go in peace to fear no more. He had authority over sickness, over disease. He also has sickness over death, because Jairus finds out that his daughter had died. And Jesus tells him, your daughter's not dead, she's just asleep. And he goes in and he says, Talitha Kuma, which is little girl, or better translated, little lamb, arise. And she gets up and he says, give her something to eat. You see, what Mark's doing in this very beginning of the gospel here, chapters 1 through 7, is he's setting the stage of Jesus' divine authority. He's showing who Jesus is. He's showing that he has authority over creation. He has authority over the demonic forces. He has authority over sickness and even death. He is the mighty Messiah. He is the Son of God. And he's making for sure we will. But you know, the religious leaders didn't like that. So we see within the section as well this conflict between him and the religious leaders, where they challenge Jesus' authority. They reject his announcement of the kingdom of God. They oppose his fellowship with sinners. They accuse him of violating the Sabbath, and Jesus criticizes them for their hypocrisy, for their obsession of external rules and their failures to share God's heart for the lost. And then we get to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is really the hinge in this gospel, where it changes focus. Jesus gets his disciples, he takes them out, and in chapter 8, starting with verse 27, we read, and Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, and others said Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he makes it a little bit more personal here. He says, but he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Christ. Verse 31, and it says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. If the first section, chapters 1 through 7, show the mighty Messiah, chapters 8 through 16 show Jesus as the suffering servant. You see, another key word throughout his gospel is this word immediately. Mark loves that word immediately. If you read throughout his gospel, you feel like you're on a roller coaster or you're in a sports car. Because he's like, immediately Jesus goes into the synagogue. Immediately Jesus leaves. Immediately he gets on a boat. Immediately he gets off. He's just flying through this first part of the gospel so we can get to this passion narrative. So we can get to Jesus as the suffering servant. And 3 times Jesus tells that he is going to die. That he is going to rise again. And each time the disciples, they have some kind of act of pride or some kind of misunderstanding. And Jesus teaches them what it means to be a leader. A servant leader. He's reminding them of who he is and why he came. But one of the things you'll notice throughout the gospel as well, there's this thing that many people call the messianic secret, which confuses us at times, because Jesus, when he would cast out a demon or he would heal someone, or even when the disciples confessed who he is, he would tell them, he would strictly charge them not to tell anyone. Why? Why would he cast out a demon and tell them not to say who he is? Why would he heal someone and tell them not to say anything? Why would he tell his disciples not to proclaim that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Because Jesus wants to define his messiahship on his own terms and in his own way. And he does that in chapter 11, or he starts to, I call it the showdown in Jerusalem. Jesus enters into Jerusalem. He curses the fig tree. He cleanses the temple. It's a sign of the rejection of the Jews because they have rejected God. And he tells this parable of the wicked tenant farmers, where the owner of this farm, he goes away and he sends a servant back to check on the farm, and they beat him and send him away. He sends another servant and they kill that one. And it goes on, and Jesus says, he thought, I'll send my son. But they kill the son. And he asks, what will the owner do to those wicked men? You see, it's interesting because all of Jesus' parables up until this point was meant to conceal the truth and only be revealed to those who could accept it. But this parable did not reveal the truth, or did not conceal the truth, but it revealed the truth. It was Jesus proclaiming to be the Messiah, and it was this proclamation that caused the Jews to want to crucify him. That messianic secret, it is out now. And Jesus is arrested. His disciples, they flee. Peter denies even knowing Jesus. When Jesus admits to being the Messiah, the high priest of the Sanhedrin calls for his execution. At his trial before Pilate, the crowds that once praised him for his teachings and healing and exorcisms now cry out for his crucifixion. And Pilate, while recognizing Jesus' innocence, now turns a blind eye to justice. And on the cross, the people walk by and they mock Jesus' claims. And Jesus dies in agony. On the cross, while he is forsaken by all. But there's really two significant events that we see while he's on the cross. And one of them is when the curtain is torn in two in the temple, signifying that no one has to go to God on your behalf no more. You can go yourself. You can boldly go to the throne room of God. You have access. The other significant event is found in Mark chapter 15, verse 39. The centurion that was guarding Jesus while he was on the cross. A man who has undoubtedly seen countless crucifixions before. It says, and when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man is the Son of God. Centurion, a pagan, confessed who Jesus was when he died on the cross. Mark's gospel ends in chapter 16. Now, some believe that Mark's gospel ends right after verse 8. So verse 9 and on, some say was not written by Mark. Either way, whichever way that you believe, I just want to let you know for when you see that footnote in your Bibles. If so, if he ends in verse 8, he ends kind of abruptly. He does end, though, with the proclamation that Jesus is alive. His gospel ends with the resurrected Jesus. The readers is left with that announcement that Jesus is alive. And that announcement asks the question, will the readers face trials and suffering with faithfulness like Jesus? Or will they flee and deny him like his disciples? Will the readers respond with faith and confession like the centurion at the cross, or with unbelief and rejection like the religious leaders? You see, Mark's gospel ends with a call to respond. How will the reader respond to this mighty Messiah? How will they respond to this suffering servant? And it's a question that each of us has to answer. Because each of us will answer it one way or another. We will respond. We will either respond in faithfulness and confess that he is the mighty Messiah, that he is the suffering servant who died on the cross for us. So that while we fell, he is faithful. Or we reject it. And we flee. And we forsake it. It's a choice that each and every one of us has to make. So will you make that decision?